All right. Well, welcome everybody to the monthly cybersecurity seminar series hosted by the UC San Francisco-Stanford Center of Excellence in Regulatory Science and Innovation and FDA. And we meet every third Thursday of the month during the academic year. My name is Kevin Fu. I'm a professor at Northeastern University, and it's my pleasure to host this seminar series on behalf of the CIRSE and FDA. A quick disclaimer, this seminar does not represent official FDA policy or guidance, and the contents are those of the speakers and do not necessarily represent the official views of nor an endorsement by FDA, HHS, or the US government. This seminar is being recorded. Here's my bio. I'm glad to be your moderator for today, and you're always welcome to reach out on LinkedIn if you'd like to keep up to date on the different seminars that are being offered on cybersecurity for medical devices. A couple of announcements before we get into our talk today by Suzanne Schwartz. If you're interested in careers, FDA wants to hire you. Here's a little job advertisement, and you can reach out to diane.mitchell@fda.hhs.gov if you'd like to hear about opportunities for cybersecurity and medical devices. So why are we here today? There's been no shortage of news on challenges for protecting medical devices. This is just one article from earlier this year in the Wall Street Journal, where medical device manufacturers are working to protect their devices from the endemic threats of the internet and beyond. It's a great challenge today to protect medical devices. There have been a number of legislative approaches and executive orders to change the regulatory landscape, and you'll be hearing about some of that today. And also there's new draft regulatory guidance from FDA. This issued in April of 2022, draft cybersecurity QSR for pre-market, essentially what goes into the engineering of medical device, recommendations for building in security into medical device design. This is one of the documents still under draft and hopefully will be finalized in short order. So we've been talking a lot about technology and incident response and policy over the last year, and it's my pleasure today to host Dr. Suzanne Schwartz. She is the director of the Office of Strategic Partnerships and Technology Innovation at the FDA Center for Devices and Radiological Health, also known as OST. Today, we'll be having a fireside chat with Suzanne on updates from FDA on medical device cybersecurity. And it's my pleasure to have you here today, Suzanne. So welcome. Welcome to the
program. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here with you, Kevin.
Yes, so there are so many interesting things going on with medical device security and FDA. I'm even beginning to lose count of all the interesting advancements and cooperation with industry and healthcare delivery organizations and patients. I was wondering if maybe you could begin with just painting a vignette of what is the state of medical device security through the FDA lens? What are some things we should be knowing about?
Yeah, thank you. You know, it's funny because even going back years ago, I would always say the state of medical device cybersecurity is evolving, and that tends to be a truism, even to date. But I think we're really fortunate, and we're very appreciative to see some of the changes that have been occurring over the past years. I'll put in a plug as well that this year, 2023, actually ends up being the 10th anniversary for FDA's work in medical device cybersecurity from the standpoint of when we actually stood up a small team and a concerted effort within CDRH for medical device cybersecurity. And it's been a wild ride actually since, from the standpoint of our approach having been very much reactive at the beginning. We were pulled into issues as a result of vulnerabilities identified in medical devices by security researchers and needing to really understand exactly what does that landscape actually look like. And from there went on to issuing our first policy guidances, the pre-market guidance back in in 2014, and then on to recognizing that this is an evolving field. And while we're dealing with the importance of being able to make sure that the design of devices from the very start incorporates or builds in security, we're also at the same time needing to deal with all of the post-market issues that arise. And so, you know, by the time we finished the 2014 guidance, we were already on to also articulating or working on articulating what our policy would be on the post-market side. And this continues to be an iterative process for us, always engaging with our stakeholders as well, whether it's, you know, within industry as well as healthcare provider organizations, patients, other agencies. And, you know, and so fast forward to where we are at present in 2023, you mentioned in your, you know, in your opening remarks, in your opening notes that there's a draft guidance on pre-market that was published in April 2022. And we made a commitment, you know, very publicly to work towards targeting finalization of that new pre-market guidance in this fiscal year, in 2023. So folks should hold their breath, but we are approaching the very tip end of fiscal year 2023. And what I'll say is that we are on target. So, you know, fingers crossed, there will be a finalization of that guidance on the pre-market side. Sorry about that. For you know, for industry and stakeholders to refer to. And obviously the difference between, just, you know, for the audience as well, the difference between the draft and the final is, we always say at FDA, a draft is not for implementation. However, a final guidance is. And so this final guidance, which will, you know, hopefully be issued in due time, will provide that further clarity as to what the FDA expects to see in the pre-market submissions. And we have the added, you know, benefit of having also received new authorities over the past year as well, you know, through the Omnibus or the Patch Act, and that's included in what's called 524B. And so you'll see references in the new guidance to that, which really kind of helps start to pull everything together in what we are doing in the medical device space. All that to say that we're raising the bar. We continue to raise the bar. We continue to, you know, expect more in terms of medical devices as they go on to the market. And we are in turn seeing, you know, that manufacturers, you know, recognize that they need to, you know, really kind of step up to the plate in order to be able to get their devices on the market.
Right. So I'm sure one of the burning questions many manufacturers have on this note, if you don't mind a follow-up, is you know, making sure they're prepared to follow this. So they've had over a year to prepare for at least looking at the draft guidance. What do you think it looks like over the coming months, or after the guidance is finalized? What should we expect to see between FDA and industry and other stakeholders in getting folks to better understand what's expected? Maybe you can just help us understand. Are you going to be on the road? What should we expect?
Yeah, let's talk about a couple of things. So yes, you referred to the pre-market guidance. It's over a year already. Remember, guidance is just recommendations there. But we did also put out, and I want to make a point on you know, being very clear about this, because we had gotten statutory authorities in the Omnibus in December of 2022 at the tail end. And as you know, those went into implementation 90 days later. So March 29th, 2023, right. The Omnibus went into effect, into implementation. We did release at the same time another guidance that was immediately implementable called the RTA guidance, Refuse to Accept Policy Guidance. That guidance articulated that, yeah, we're going to hold you to the provisions within the statute immediately, for all those new submissions coming in from heretofore, from March 29th. However, because there is an expected learning curve, rather than refusing to accept submissions as they come in the door, if they're missing component pieces of what needs to be in that submission as a result of cybersecurity, which is what the refuse to accept policy is, it's primarily an administrative policy in order to lessen the burden on our review staff, that we would work in a collaborative and a coordinated manner from that March 29th date all the way around to October 1st of this year. In other words, in a few weeks, couple of weeks time, so that if there are pieces that are missing administratively from the pre-market submission, we weren't going to just auto reject that submission. The reviewers who were assigned that submission would work collaboratively, and coordinate with the manufacturer to make sure that those items that need to be part of the submission now, by statute, they are required, they're not merely recommended, that those items get filled in. So that is to say, first of all, that RTA policy comes around, October 1st. In other words, from there to going forward, those submissions need to be whole as far as having all those elements within them. That's number one. And I will say that from that March period all the way through the present, myself, my team have really tried to be on the road or, speak at various opportunities that we can with industry and with the community at large to explain this, to explain what would be happening. And now if we skip forward to the finalization of the pre-market guidance, what we would plan on doing there, which is also very typical for any guidance that gets finalized at the FDA, is not only the socialization at opportunities such as conferences, but also we will be planning a webinar, which is, again, one way that we can actually walk through all of the, aspects of the guidance, and it's always recorded. There's opportunity for Q&A at the end of that webinar. So while we haven't announced the date of the webinar yet, we don't want to get ahead of our skis here. We need to get the guidance out first.
Right.
But the webinar would happen thereafter. And in addition to that, we're getting into the October National Cybersecurity Awareness Month and that entire season. And so there will be plenty of opportunities at various conferences for us to speak to, again, what the final guidance states about what manufacturers need to do in getting their submissions, getting their documentation in good standing, so that when the reviewers receive it, it will, hopefully be, streamlined and smooth without having to go back and forth a lot.
Yeah. Are you in a position where you can comment at all on, now that we're approaching the end of this period before October 1, there's probably been quite a bit of back and forth and 510Ks. Are there anything interesting to report from learnings from this interaction as you're working together with the entities who are submitting the various documents to help them learn how to meet those requirements today?
Yeah, I think that the biggest question remains, from what we've heard in our interactions with industry and manufacturers. And no surprise there, because we had already gleaned that this was going to be, the big question, even at the time that the public docket, was open on the draft, is, SBOM, and what depth and of information needs to be included within the SBOM, and how should that SBOM be transmitted. And, I think that of all things, seems to be giving most folks the greatest sense of, kind of questions or angst as far as what is the agency actually looking for. And we've pointed to, what the NTIA, had put forth in terms of its recommendations for inclusion within an SBOM, and there isn't anything that, that you're going to see that is in some ways a pivot from that approach. Recognizing again that this is an area that is also maturing. There's more tooling that's becoming available around SBOMs. We know that there are a lot of, now third-party vendors who are delving into the area to, provide that kind of service to manufacturers. This will, continue to, sort itself out a bit over time. But in terms of any other things that might be coming up in the way of submissions, I think that we've had the advantage of really, trying always to be very forward-leaning and socializing of what, manufacturers should be providing in their submissions. So even, during this period with the draft having been in place, there's, I think, a reasonable sense with most manufacturers as to what is going to make the cut with regard to sufficient documentation, depth of information or detailed information, and what isn't. And that will obviously continue over the next few months, but no real big surprises.
Okay.
I'll say that. Yeah.
And I imagine a lot of it boils down to classic risk management, cybersecurity risk management, or
Yes. And there's, I think you had this on one of your, one of the intro slides around things like threat modeling. There's threat modeling and there's threat modeling. That's one of the reasons why we had invested, commissioned, an effort around a threat modeling playbook and threat modeling boot camps and a workshop, because this is important in terms of information that needs to be submitted to the agency. And, there was, certainly a huge variance across manufacturers in terms of what that looked like, at least, in past few years. But, now I think that there's a better understanding of what it is that we're expecting to see in that realm. And because also, so I also would emphasize, because the statute emphasizes the concept of reasonable assurance of cybersecurity, in addition to, obviously, we always have the mandate of reasonable assurance of safety and effectiveness of medical devices. And it calls out, let me just make sure that I don't mistake the language here. Hang on.
It's an open book exam, I believe.
Design. Yes, I have not memorized 524B, although having said it enough times, you'd think I'd know it in my sleep. But every word counts, right? Design, develop, and maintain processes and procedures to provide reasonable assurance that device and related systems are cyber secure. And this includes, ensuring that devices are able to be updated and patched. So that capability is now part of being included, within the pre-market submission, and there has to be evidence of that. And that was, if you remember, going back to when we had put out years ago the Medical Device Safety Action Plan, one of the items that we signaled there was the consideration for wanting to be able to require just that. All part of the process of trying to break us out of this brittle legacy cycle of devices that end up on the market that are unable to be patched or updated, and that remain, exposed surfaces for attack.
So, and to what degree does this affect legacy devices that have already gone through the 510K, PMA, and so on and so forth, versus devices that are starting afresh through the regulatory review?
So yeah, and so that's where the cut is. And I will say that our wish and what we really were proposing was a more overarching approach with the Patch Act originally, and with our own proposals for new legislation that would be directly impacting current legacy devices, current devices that are in use or in distribution, that are already authorized on the market. Where we landed is that the Patch Act is written for devices, for new submissions that would be going onto the market. Having said that, a couple of things to emphasize, and that is that while it is, forward-looking in terms of only new devices, the statute takes a TPLC approach, right? It talks about the fact that, the ability to update and patch devices as vulnerabilities are identified, that they are being done in a timely manner, that needs to be part of the pre-market submission. Policies and processes or procedures around coordinated disclosure, that has to be part of the pre-market submission. So while it doesn't look retroactively at devices that are already out there, the putting all the building blocks in place for new devices so that they are, able to be supported and made, cyber secure through the lifetime, and that the appropriate procedures are being followed by the device industry, including, the maintenance of the SBOM, that will all be there. So that's the one point I make. The other is that there could be certainly situations where there are devices that are already on the market that have been authorized, and a modification may be introduced to that device, a modification that per other FDA policy would warrant a new 510K submission, right? So there's a software modifications guidance. I don't want to take us too far afield, but we do know obviously that there's policy that the agency has put out regarding when does a modification to a device rise to the level that for that device, it does need to come back in as a 510K, as a new submission. In those scenarios, in those situations, if a device was undergoing such a modification that warranted a new 510K, under the new 510K, that device would be obligated to 524B.
Interesting. Okay. So you mentioned a lot about software updates, and you said threat modeling. There's threat modeling, and then there's threat modeling. There's also software updates, and then there's software updates. What comes to my mind is timeline for a software update. So whether it's a vulnerability in proprietary software of a medical device, or whether it's a vulnerability, let's say, in some third-party product that presumably would be encoded in an SBOM now. What are some expectations in terms of timelines, or what should one be thinking about for that risk calculus in to truly count as a reasonable process for secure updates in terms of time?
Yeah. So I definitely want to point us back to the post-market guidance, which is in effect, which does describe the difference between controlled vulnerabilities and uncontrolled vulnerabilities. And uncontrolled vulnerabilities were the ones that, per the assessment done by a manufacturer, that they have an unreasonable or an unacceptable, I should say, risk to health. And that those types of vulnerabilities, what we really underscored in that guidance is the importance of addressing those as expediently as possible. and expediently as possible, to the extent that we also, we included an incentive, a regulatory incentive within the guidance, indicating that under any other scenario, such a risk to health that's unacceptable, that needs to be mitigated, would require a Part 806 corrections and removals kind of notification to the agency. But if the manufacturer, in this case, was really expedient in this sense, and they met specific criteria that we called out in that post-market guidance, one of them being the time frame of not only assessing, but also appropriately disclosing and providing a mitigation to that vulnerability within a very short window, and that they were a participant in something called a medical device ISAO, medical device information sharing analysis organization. And then the third element was there is no known actual adverse event that had occurred to a patient that we would not enforce Part 806. And that remains current policy. We have not, changed that policy around. Again, the push towards really needing to address things quickly. The statute uses similar but somewhat different language. The statute does talk about addressing vulnerabilities that are, hang on, let me make sure I get this correct. Okay, that on a reasonably justified regular cycle, known unacceptable vulnerabilities, that these need to be addressed. And then, as soon as possible, out of cycle, critical vulnerabilities that could cause uncontrolled risks. So that B part, the latter phrase that I mentioned, is to what, I don't want to get into interpreting that right now, because there'll be opportunity to interpret in guidance going forward. But the language of uncontrolled risks matches up a bit with our uncontrolled vulnerabilities and speaks to the importance of addressing what they are calling critical vulnerabilities in the statute as soon as possible, out of cycle. And so that's the analog, or that kind of parallels what we talk about in the post-market guidance. The controlled vulnerabilities, we also want manufacturers to address those, but they shouldn't be left just as is. But addressing those on a reasonable level within a cycle that here's where it gets also somewhat tricky. We have heard from from industry at times that they could be ready to deploy various patches or updates, but given the magnitude of devices that sit on HDO systems, for the HDOs, it can be difficult to, be able to work with those deployments or updates if it's not on set cycles. So there does need to be a meeting of the minds, or working together, coordinating across both the HDOs as well as the manufacturers here, in order to make the most of these particular provisions.
Well, I want to get into some of the different stakeholders in a moment, but one other follow-up here on the notion of uncontrolled risk. When we say the word security or cybersecurity, it means different things to different people. And I know this is outside of FDA, but if you think of it in terms of the lens of Office of Civil Rights, OCR, most people equate it to privacy or breaches of patient data. But here, of course, we're talking more about the safety and effectiveness, the therapies, diagnostics. And so my question is, here's sort of an easy yes, no, but maybe you can expand upon it. There's a breach, but then there's also the availability of a medical device due to a cybersecurity risk. So if a medical device or a product line becomes unavailable because of a cybersecurity threat, is that considered uncontrolled? What should we be thinking?
Yeah, we have had a few instances of this already, since we released that guidance. And risk to health and patient safety concerns can result from the lack of availability of a intervention, whether it's a imaging, diagnostic intervention, whether it's a therapeutic intervention. And so even as these different types of cyber attacks have occurred, ransomware attacks have occurred on healthcare facilities where devices have, for example, have needed to be taken, everything's been taken offline or taken down, and therefore patients who would normally come in, for example, through an ER, you can, take a level 1 trauma center, for example, or a, a center, a stroke that deals with stroke patients, where time, in either case, time is of the essence. And physicians today, providers rely very much on equipment, including the imaging devices and other therapeutic devices, in order to be able to inform the appropriate next steps, therapeutics, treatments, life-saving measures for patients. So when these kinds of, attacks occur, or if a breach occurs, and so there is a need for us to understand whether that device is now not able to function at all, is not, again, because it's either deliberately taken down, or it's been in some ways impacted. And we do consider those to be, to answer your question, we do consider that to be uncontrolled risk. And one that we've been paying a lot more attention to over the past several years. Given the frequency of ransomware attacks that are occurring within the healthcare space, within the healthcare sector, this is an area that definitely, warrants all eyes on it.
Right. And I certainly see educational, shall we say, a euphemism, challenges for this particular kind of uncontrolled risk. Well, I'll hear manufacturers claiming what they call 4 nines of availability, meaning not down for more than 53 minutes per year. But of course, if a medical device outage happens for, let's say, 4 to 6 weeks, something's not quite adding up. So I feel like there's probably quite a bit of the manufacturing community where maybe the cybersecurity engineering group needs to work with the reliability folks to explain that these numbers are not necessarily representative of the cybersecurity risk.
Yeah.
Anyhow, that's my soapbox. Okay, but getting back to stakeholders, I'm curious what FDA has been hearing. I know FDA spends a huge amount of effort with listening sessions. Patients, clinicians, manufacturers, the healthcare delivery organizations. What are things you've learned about from various communities with so many things? We've got the draft guidance, we've got the omnibus bill, we've got the RTA. What are some things that we might want to know about?
Yeah. Where to start, Kevin? I think that, it's interesting because one of the areas that I think, for us at FDA, we want to be able to continue to do better, a lot better. And it's not just us at FDA. We've got to work together, across the ecosystem, but it is around engaging patients and engaging clinicians as well. And by clinicians, now I'm talking specifically in different areas, not the healthcare delivery organization institution, but rather on engaging clinicians of different specialties so that there is an understanding through their specific lens of what they do, of their discipline, of what they need to be mindful of or be understanding of when it comes to medical devices, patient safety, cyber safety. And we talk a lot about, cyber security is cyber safety is a patient safety issue. And can you hear me, by the way?
Yes.
I'm getting a message that my internet is unstable. Okay. All right. it's clear to us from some of the engagements that we've had proactively, even from patients who really want to understand more about the devices that they rely upon for their lives, either, whether they're implantable devices or devices that, reside within their homes that they utilize at various times. The information that is provided to patients is not necessarily, I guess, satisfying to patients, is probably the best way to put it. And we continue to have these conversations with individuals as well as with patient advocacy groups. There have been efforts underway that we've taken on with the establishment of a patient engagement advisory committee, a PEAC. And one of our meetings, the 2019 meeting, was focused actually on medical device cybersecurity and how to best inform patients around vulnerabilities and around risks, because again, there's a balance here in communicating also. We don't want to alarm the public or patients or create a sense of panic or hysteria when these devices perform such critical functions. And like I said, patients rely upon these devices. On the other hand, patients, by being empowered with more knowledge around the cybersecurity of the device, is an advantage across the board to everyone, because they then can be the first ones to also identify an issue with their device and to perhaps bring it forward to their clinician or to the FDA or to their hospital or whomever, or their clinic, as something that that they have questions about or concerns about, and should they do anything about it? Is there anything that they need to understand better? So I think that is an area where we are going to need to put more, more work into, more focus. While we work with others across the ecosystem in further educating and informing clinicians, some of the bigger challenges I think that, that we're having is the big legacy issue, especially as it concerns hospitals that are not well resourced, and that may be in more remote areas, more underserved communities, and that are not well positioned from the standpoint of having personnel on board also that can really be doing, full-time job of monitoring from a cybersecurity perspective. And those are the institutions often which are dealing with a lot of legacy devices that may not necessarily also be able to be replaced because of the expenses associated with that kind of capital equipment. So legacy really remains probably current legacy remains one of the biggest challenges that we are facing. And I say we here is to really represent the ecosystem at large. Fortunately, it's a recognized challenge, and it's one that different stakeholders are coming to the table and trying to come up with different mitigations, at least for now. But this is not something that is going to go away anytime soon, and we really look forward to trying to do our share of what we can do in the interim, working with other stakeholders.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's really helpful to know, especially with so many changes in the last 18 months or so coming. And it sounds like October 1 is a big day with the new federal fiscal year, among other things. But I have just one more question. So we have about 5 minutes left. And imagine a manufacturer who has not yet been through a vulnerability disclosure process. Maybe they're not even familiar with the concept of the 806 exemption. Maybe just tell us a little bit about, I know there's so many different ways, but just, choose one maybe that's common of what does the process look like when a security vulnerability or a security incident is eventually reported to FDA? I know there's a lot of coordination. I don't think people outside of FDA are entirely familiar with the degree of coordination that goes on. And maybe you could tell us a little bit about different stakeholders and what that process looks like.
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's got multiple parts in terms of the answers, depending upon the kind of disclosure that a type of vulnerability it is. As you know, there are many different types. So first off, we have a memorandum of agreement with CISA. And we've worked very closely with CISA, the Cybersecurity Information Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency, which is part of DHS. And what this MOA allows us to do is, to work very closely, information sharing wise, and coordinating around vulnerability response as well as incident response. And so sometimes a vulnerability that's identified that affects a medical device or maybe a whole slew of medical devices, if it's a third-party software, that may come to CISA's attention before it comes to ours. But CISA, because of the relationship that we have with CISA, which is a very close one, we have regularly scheduled with, in other words, a recurring cadence of meetings that we have with their working operations team. We will, be able to discuss those vulnerabilities. And when we find out about information with, incoming, then we will then take a look through our systems in order to assess, first of all, what might be impacted, which devices may be impacted. This is where I'm saying it's going to be different if it's a very unique vulnerability to a specific medical device, where at least then you're dealing perhaps with a single manufacturer versus the kind of more coordinated response, which might involve having to bring in the entire, trade group, the entire industry in order to really suss out the fleets of devices that may be impacted. But once that, once the parties are brought in on the manufacturing side, we will do an assessment on the FDA side with our subject matter experts, including, from a clinical perspective, depending upon what the devices are, as to whether, whether we would consider that vulnerability to be controlled, uncontrolled, et cetera. And we will work with industry on that front too. Depending upon where all of that lands, then there's going to be, generally speaking, a disclosure by the manufacturer, which would include a description of what the vulnerabilities are, how they were assessed, and which devices are impacted, as well as what the appropriate mitigations are, and if necessary, remediations are. If there is going to need to be, specific updates that need to be deployed to devices, does that mean that patients that may have implantables, do they have to get called into their doctor's offices to have that done in the doctor's office? So now you're also thinking, we will often bring in, by the way, the professional societies involved in those cases as well for further discussion around the clinical assessment of the issue, and have to do that benefit risk calculus in terms of the population that may be impacted by it. Essentially, though, we want to make sure that when that disclosure occurs, that there is alignment across the different parties so that the direction and the directives that are given are not in conflict with each other. So, we would make sure to take on the appropriate recommendations in concert with what was agreed upon with the manufacturer, and at times with the professional society as well. And we will point to the manufacturer's disclosure and a link, they would like them to point to ours. And at the same time, CISA as well will release usually a technical ICS advisory or alert, which they will point to our safety communication or update, so that you have this, again, alignment across all bodies, all parties around, what does this vulnerability represent? And, and while our comms is going to speak to it from a public health perspective, directing patients, directing clinicians or providers what they need to do, or hospitals what they need to do. The manufacturers will also be providing that information, as well as the technical info, and CISA will the same. And so that's kind of a very rapid response to this. But at times it can be a multi-party coordination. There might be multiple parties involved, even in terms of third-party vendors that we've had to engage in this case. So hence the importance of having coordinated disclosure policies and processes already in place at your, within the firm.
It sounds like quite the orchestra
It is very much orchestrated. That's exactly right.
Well, thanks for that. Trying to demystify sort of the magic that goes on behind the scenes. And I know we're running short on time. I do want to give you an opportunity. Any last minute thoughts for our audience of manufacturers and biomedical engineering students and faculty and other stakeholders about medical device security and FDA?
Yeah, so again, cyber safety is patient safety. We can't repeat that often enough. We are, very interested in students or fellows or folks who are doing, interested in a career in this area. Who want to explore potential projects, research projects with us. Certainly, we have a lot of internal areas that we would love to be able to explore further. And so the opportunities exist. And we're hoping that we'll be able to, talk further about those as we move into fiscal year 24 of what those opportunities look like. But in the meantime, we've always tried to maintain a very open door approach and policy that doesn't matter who the stakeholder is, whether it's the medical device manufacturer or trade organization, whether it's a patient, whether it's a provider, whether it is a HDO, whether it's a security researcher, that folks know that they can come to us. Cybermed at fda.hhs.gov is one way to come in, as well as you can reach out to myself or any members of our team. And we really pride ourselves on trying to be as responsive as possible.
Thank you so much for joining us today, Suzanne. This has been a Fireside Chat with Dr. Suzanne Schwartz from FDA on medical device security. Thanks so much for joining the UCSF-Stanford CERSI FDA seminar series.
Thank you.